2.
Thanks, Demiurge.
The first thing Cocytus did after their master had left the throne room was bow low and thank his comrade. Demiurge flashed his usual smile. That's not necessary.
I insist. We would have had to kill all the Lizardmen if it weren't for you.
I said you don't have to worry about it, Cocytus. I think this is what Lord Ainz wanted from the start. Someone answered, "Huh?" to Demiurge and his single raised finger. Cocytus had the feeling it could have been him or one of the other guardians. In other words, I think he made you general in the attack on the Lizardman village because he anticipated the remarks you made earlier. He appeared extremely happy when you said you were against destroying the villages, and he seemed disappointed when you couldn't make a counter-proposal.
You mean he was disappointed because things didn't go according to plan?
That's right, Shaltier. In other words, there is a very high probability that all the things that were said here were according to his plan.
He was able to foresee everything? I'd expect nothing less from Lord Ainz. But, you know, spit it out!
Aura sharply urged on her fidgeting little brother.
I am. I was just wondering why we used such weak undead. Just maybe, but, maybe he assumed we would lose?
Or rather than losing, perhaps he thought Cocytus would investigate how strong they were and advise on whether or not we could win. Cocytus remembered his talk with Demiurge, and the same shame welled up inside him. So he'd been doing it all wrong.
That plan would be impossible to make without knowing Cocytus's personality inside out. Magnificent, Lord Ainz.
I learned during the exceptional duel with Shaltier that Lord Ainz's skill as a fighter is exceptional, but he's also a brilliant strategist. I really admire him. He says all those nice things, but we're just his pawns. Demiurge gave his remarks as the most brilliant mind among the Nazarick Guardians.
He is simply too amazing. Perhaps he just arrived to lead the Supreme Beings on a whim.
Shaltier shivered with joy as she spoke of their master, and the other Guardians nodded in agreement. Ainz returned to his room and dove into bed. After being airborne for an unusually long time, his body clumsily sank into the mattress. Then he rolled around for a bit. To the right, to the left. It was something he could do only because the bed was so gigantic. Ainz rolled back and forth, giggling a little, paying not the slightest attention to the fact that his luxurious robe was getting all wrinkled. Of course, he was acting like a little kid only because no one else was in the room. Eventually, after returning sufficiently to childlike innocence and enjoying the softness of the bed to the fullest degree, he lay there and stared at the ceiling.
Man, I'm beat. I want to throw back some drinks and get totally wasted, but I can't do either.
He grumbled and heaved a sigh, albeit an imitation sigh since he didn't actually breathe. Because he was undead, neither physical nor mental exhaustion affected him, but every day of the past month or so had taken a toll on his human mental state. If he weren't undead, he would have had stomach trouble for sure. There was a lot of pressure on Ainz in his position. Momon the warrior defeated a silver-haired vampire, Shaltier. For someone who knew nothing, it was simply an amazing feat, but for the ones who had used the world item on Shaltier, it held a different meaning. There was a high probability they would come after him, or try to contact him. For that reason, Ainz was always on alert and carried cash store items so he could make a quick getaway at any time. In his free time, still on guard, he role-played, or image-trained, in his head how to figure out how to run away while gathering intelligence in the event they tried to make contact. Those tense days still had no effect on Ainzul Gon, but the vestiges of the human Satoru Suzuki were a wreck. The moment he was alone in a free and open space, away from the pressure of having to act like the ruler of Nazarick, he had probably regressed to a childlike state not out of Ainz's wishes, but because Satoru Suzuki had been stretched thin and wanted to act out.
I don't think I've ever worked this long without a day off. I wonder how much overtime I get this month.
This flavor of mumbled griping, too, was perhaps Satoru Suzuki strongly manifesting.
The great tomb of Nazarick. No, Ainzul Gon. It's not really a corporation. We are a limited partnership and a fair company that guarantees its workers overtime pay.
After grumbling a little, he furrowed his non-existent brow.
There are managerial bonuses, so I don't get overtime. Ah!
He began rolling back and forth again. After 5 laps, he stopped on a dime.
Now then, enough with this nonsense. But wow, I can't believe Kakaitis said all that stuff.
He hadn't imagined that such a thing was possible. Kakaitis wanted to show the Lizardmen mercy. That was a real problem for Ainz. Satoru Suzuki's personality was such that he went into presentations with plenty of documents prepared. He wasn't very good at dealing with unexpected questions, but if the answer was written down in his documents, he could just read it. In other words, to Satoru Suzuki, the key to a good presentation was doing enough research that he could answer any question thrown at him. With such an outlook, he wasn't very good at adapting on the fly. No, he'd gone past that. He hated it. Of course, he couldn't march into the throne room with documents and say, "Now, please take a look at the next page." That was why he'd gone over what would happen in the throne room in his head more than 10 times, hoping all the while that no one would do anything that would take him by surprise. Kakaitis had shattered that tiny hope. He'd been really nervous about what Kakaitis was going to say, but he was glad he'd said it. He felt a kind of familial happiness, like when a quiet child says something selfish for the first time. Above all, Kakaitis had grown far more than he'd expected him to. One time, when Ainz returned to Nazarick, he had had a maid cook for him. He had requested a steak. Taking into consideration things like how well done it should be would have required some practice, but he didn't ask for anything terribly complicated. And he wasn't asking for any stat bonuses like one would get from cooked food in Yggdrasil. As long as he could eat it, there wouldn't have been any problem. But the result of her cooking was just a black lump. No matter how many times that maid cooked, the only outcome was carbonized meat. While accepting her sincere apologies, Ainz had been satisfied with the expected result. It was the same as when he had tried to equip a greatsword in his dressing room. In Yggdrasil, a specific skill was needed in order to cook. Perhaps that was only natural, since eating and drinking gave temporary ability boosts. That maid didn't have the skill. In short, without the skill, try as one might, cooking would end in failure. With the Kakaitis exercise, Ainz had tried partially as an experiment to see if beings who had already been created, like Ainz and the others, could still gain new skills. If Kakaitis could gain tactical and strategic knowledge, that would be evidence for the possibility that Ainz and the others could still grow. The reason he'd made Kakaitis command such weak undead was simply because he figured there was more to learn from defeat. And he was satisfied with the results. Kakaitis had shown that growth was feasible. Of course, mastering techniques and gaining knowledge were two very different things. Ainz's aim for the future, if he had one, was to become proficient in this world's unique system of magic. Was magic techniques or knowledge? Ainz still wasn't sure, but now he had tested for the knowledge case at least. Cocytus had taught him that growth was possible. He'd done a fine job.
Lack of growth is stagnation, plain and simple. Even if I'm counted among the strong now, someday I'll get overtaken,
Ainz thought. Even if he had military technology from 100 years in the future, if he stopped progressing there, he would someday fall from the position of the strongest. He might be considered strong within the neighboring countries now, but operating from the assumption that such strength would last forever would make him a fool. That said, though I'm happy at our child's progress, I do worry whether his behavior is appropriate for someone who is supposed to be completely loyal to me. Ainz grumbled and looked up at the ceiling. This is so scary. The vestiges of the human Satoru Suzuki were shrieking in response to this newest anxiety. Progress is change. So who could say that the Guardian's current absolute loyalty would remain the same? Even if it did, he was terrified of being judged unworthy to be the ruler of glorious Nazarick, of being branded unfit to be guildmaster. I have to be a leader worthy of their loyalty. Will anyone give me a crash course in emperorhood? There was no one who'd created such a convenient school within the walls of Nazarick, that was for sure. Ainz mulled over the issue, and two figures came to mind. They were two of the 5 worst, the Prince of Fear and the King of Hungry Proliferum, royal both. He seriously considered getting an education from them, but in the end dismissed the idea with one word. Nope. He didn't want to be taught by either of them, not unless he was in some dire straits. Well, I guess it's fine, as long as I don't make too many mistakes. I don't imagine anyone will be telling me to retire anytime soon. Other than that... Oh. Bipedal sheep. Ainz had already realized what their true identity must be, which was why he hadn't asked Demiurge for a description of their appearance. He'd seen a similar monster in Yggdrasil. Heads of a goat and a lion, tail of a snake. And then arms of a lion, feet of a goat. No doubt about it. Gotta be a chimera. The chimera in Yggdrasil stood upright on 2 goat legs and attacked with lion paw arms. It had 2 heads, a lion's and a goat's. It was essentially a Baphomet clone, since the developers had used the same graphical data as a base. Still, that did leave the question of why, if they were chimeras, Demiurge didn't just say so. But Ainz already knew the answer. In short, it must be a subspecies of chimera. That's it, right, Demiurge? Ainz giggled. Then he changed his opinion of Demiurge to surprising lack of knack for naming things. In Yggdrasil, those chimera lords and other different types were kinda... Well, but those fish chimera looked so bizarre they were sickening. A new type of chimera. Abylian chimera. Maybe I should have him bring one here. Then there was... Victim. It looked exactly as he'd remembered it, but just one thing was bothering him. Is that really Enochian, the language the angels are said to speak? It sounds like something else. Since it was translated, Ainz didn't know what language it was speaking, but he vaguely sensed something. Of course, it didn't help that he didn't know Enochian either. Well, whatever. Okay, I guess I have to get ready to head to the front. He rolled around one last time, reluctant to leave, and then, while he was face down, he checked something he'd noticed before. He buried his face in the bed and inhaled. Granted, he didn't have lungs, so it was only an imitation, but for some reason he could still smell. There's a floral scent. Are they perfuming my bed? Is this just what rich people's beds are like? If so, that's pretty awesome.
I wonder if I should nitpick about stuff like this when I pretend to be a rich person.